I'm going to show you how to sew a cylinder, and there are going to be two different ways of finishing. So the top will be finished differently than the bottom. So we have a piece of fabric I cut 9 inches long and 4 inches tall, and then 2 pieces of fabric 9 inches long by 2 inches tall. So here's my base of my cylinder, and it's 9 inches long and it's 4 inches tall. So I'm just looking for the right side of the fabric, and I'm going to put right sides together. So I'm going to go ahead and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. My needle came unthreaded. Turn the machine off to thread my needle just to be safe. And unlike the home sewing machines, my needle gets threaded from left to right on this machine. So it's really important to have a long piece of thread hanging from the needle. So I'm just going to stitch forward, back a couple stitches, then I go all the way down. So there's my seam. If you want to zigzag along the edge of this, you can to have a finished seam. I'm not going to right now. So I'm just going to iron the seam flat. But first I'm going to go ahead and sew these ones also. So the same, I fold them in half. Make sure my needle's in my fabric. And when I'm sewing multiple things together, I can line them up. I get to the end of the first one and I'm going backwards. And then I go to the second one and I go backwards. And I finish sewing. This is great if you're sewing like 10 or 100 pieces. You can just line them up and keep sewing and not have to stop. It makes it a lot faster. So I've ironed the cylinder, the seam of it flat. And now I've ironed both of the rings. So first I started by ironing the seam flat. And now I'm going to fold the cylinder so the seams are on the inside. I'm going to iron that. And I already did that to this cylinder here. So here you want to be real careful to match up the edges of the fabric. Be careful not to iron your fingers, especially to steam, sometimes it can get you. Just iron it in half and make sure not to crease the edges. Now I'm going to take this outside and fold it down 1/4 inch and iron it. And I'm just going to take my ruler and check. So there's 1/4 inch. And this is where I really want to be careful with my fingers. And I'm going to go all the way around, ironing it down 1/4 inch. And And you're gonna wanna use a ruler to do this unless you've done it a lot. And ironing is really important for this so everything stays in place. You can see how the fabric is starting to fray, so that's why it's really important that we finish these pieces properly so the fabric isn't fraying. Okay, so I have that one folded in. I'm just gonna lay it down and really give it a good steam. Now I'm gonna do the other side. And now I'm gonna fold it in half and have those seams there. So the seams should line up. So I'm just laying it flat, making sure all the seams are there. I'm going to iron it again to hold that into place. And then I'm going to go around the circle to really make sure it's ironed. And this seems like a lot of extra steps just to iron, but it makes a huge difference when you're sewing. It makes it a lot easier to have everything ironed in place. Okay, so one has these raw edges, the other is folded over. Okay, so I have the right side facing out of the cylinder, and then this folded piece with the raw edges at the very top. And I'm gonna sew around 1/4 inch, and then that will flip open. And I've overlapped these seams here so I don't have a bunch of fabric that I'm trying to sew through there. So I'm just shifting that seam to the left of the other seam. Now this one will just slide on top of that cylinder, and I'm gonna sew on top of it so it's nice and finished on both sides. So I'm gonna sew my cylinder. I right side out of it so the seam is on the inside of the cylinder. I'm starting with the first tube or end of the tube that has the raw edge. So I have the raw edge lining up to the raw edge of the cylinder. And you can see here I have the seam from that outer circle and also the seam from the cylinder, and I'm staggering them so I have less fabric to deal with. And you could take pins and pin all the way around and take them out as you sew. So I'm going to do 1/4 inch seam allowance again, and I pull this fabric back as I get it ready to sew along. You can see I shift this cylinder around as I'm sewing. And I want to make sure all those edges are lined up as I'm going. They can shift sometimes as you're sewing. And I get back to the start. And I lift it up. So now all I need to do is fold it up, and you can see there's a nice finished edge. So I'm just gonna iron it to make it really flat. And this is a great way to have the edge of a pant, the cuff of a shirt, It's a good way to finish your piece. If you look in here, there are the raw edges of the fabric. I'm going to go ahead and top stitch all the way around this just to really secure it more. You could also do a zigzag stitch on the inside like we did for the cone to make sure that that fabric doesn't start to fray more. So I'm going to top stitch it after I do this other end. Okay, now that I have one side of the cylinder finished, I'm going to open up the cylinder, the small one that I sewed together and ironed. And I'm going to do this similar to the bias tape on the cone. So I'm going to line up the edges. And I have right sides together. So this is the right side of the cylinder, the right side is facing it. And I'm just shifting the cylinder to the outside so I can see that seam. So I want to be real careful not to sew through that. So as I get further, pull my cylinder out and keep sewing along. The nice thing about this finishing is it leaves the unfinished edges inside, so I don't have to worry about serging or zigzag stitching, and I get a really clean inside. So now what I'm going to do is fold this back to where it needs to go. I'm going to iron it one more time, and then I'm just going to top stitch along here, and that's going to get that inside. So I've ironed both of the ends, and now I'm just going to top stitch. So for the one where the edges are folded over, I'm going to top stitch on the inside. I could really do either the inside or the outside, but since the outside is sewn down, I'm going to top stitch on the inside. Make sure that I catch the whole thing. Okay, so I have that one stitched. I went off this edge just a little bit, but the thread is the same color so you can't see it. So just be careful as you're sewing. This one I'm also going to stitch on the inside, and I'm just stitching that seam down. You can see I'm putting the seam in between the legs of the presser foot. And right when my fingers get too close to the needle, I pull them out. I'm also pulling this fabric out as I reshift the fabric to make sure I don't have a wrinkle in there. And I want to go a little bit slower over this bump to make sure my needle doesn't get stuck. There we go. So I have a finished cylinder and two different ways of finishing. One has that fabric hugging on the inside and the outside, so the inside's really nice and clean. The other way I folded it, sewed it, so there's a raw edge on the inside. This could be serged with an overlock machine or zigzagged. And then I top stitched it down, which I don't have to do, but I just wanted to keep it in its place. So this is one cylinder. Then I'm going to do another one with French seams.